Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the story of the absolute most consequential royal house in English history. We're going to look at how a single family completely transformed a nation, taking it from a medieval kingdom all the way to a modern powerhouse through sheer calculation, brilliant political maneuvering, and, let's be honest here, absolute ruthlessness.
But before we really get going, I want you to consider something. Had you been born into Tudor England, under which ruler would you have chosen to live? Keep this in the back of your mind as we go, because as you'll see, navigating the shifting loyalties and the intense religious whiplash of this era was quite literally a matter of life and death. All right, let's dive right in. 118. For exactly 118 years, just 5 monarchs from one single family ruled England. And in that incredibly short span of historical time, they altered the country's religion, its wealth, and its global standing forever. Now, they weren't the strongest dynasty, nor the most stable, but in terms of sheer consequence, no royal house changed the country more profoundly.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, seizing the crown. Second, Henry VIII's revolution. Third, a kingdom divided. Fourth, Elizabeth's golden age. And finally, the Tudor legacy. We're going to trace this epic history chronologically, anchored by one massive, defining obsession: the desperate need to secure the royal succession.
Okay, part 1. Seizing the crown.
So how exactly does a family with an almost non-existent claim to the throne just take it by force? Well, it starts with a chaotic clash at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. Henry Tudor, who represented the Lancastrian side, was heavily outnumbered. He had about 5,000 troops compared to King Richard III's 8,000. And Henry's claim to the throne was incredibly weak. It came through an illegitimate line that had explicitly been barred from the succession. So how did he actually win? He won because a third party, the powerful Stanley family, waited hours on a nearby hill before finally committing their men to Henry's side. Richard III charged Henry directly, got trapped, and was killed. That actually made him the last English king to die on a battlefield. And just like that, the Tudor dynasty had arrived. Now, what's really fascinating here is the night and day contrast between the first Tudor king and the second. Henry VIII was this cautious, calculating father who inherited an empty treasury and a really treacherous nobility. So what did he do? He used tools like the Star Chamber to extract massive financial fines, basically keeping his nobles too poor to even think about rebelling. Over 24 years, he built a massive fortune and a highly stable foundation. But his son, Henry VIII, totally different story. Impulsive, extravagant, obsessed with magnificent displays, and desperately seeking military glory in France. Literally, the moment he took the throne, he immediately began spending the immense wealth his father had so carefully saved.
Which brings us to part 2, Henry VIII's revolution.
This whole era is basically defined by one man's absolute obsession with getting a male heir, a quest that ended up knocking over dominoes all across Europe. You see, Henry VIII didn't rule alone. He delegated immense authority to some brilliant men, but serving Henry was a highly dangerous job. Take Thomas Wolsey, for example. He practically ran the country, but the moment he failed to get the Pope to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he was stripped of power and died facing treason charges. Then Thomas More succeeded him, but he chose silence rather than endorse Henry's break with the Catholic Church, and he was executed. Then came Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant architect of the Reformation. He was executed on fabricated charges right after setting Henry up with a disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves. The crucial takeaway here is that the moment you failed to deliver on Henry's dynastic or personal ambitions, your downfall was swift and it was fatal.
So, to get that annulment and marry Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell engineered a truly dizzying constitutional revolution. In 1533, the Act in Restraint of Appeals declared England an empire, which entirely severed legal ties with the Pope. The very next year, the Act of Supremacy made Henry the supreme head of the English Church. And if you disagreed, well, the 1534 Treason Act made denying this new reality punishable by death. In just the span of a few years, centuries of obedience to Rome were simply erased by law.
And to enforce this entirely new reality and, fund his massive ambitions, Henry oversaw the dissolution of over 800 monasteries, priories, and convents across England. This wasn't just some religious shift. It was a massive transfer of wealth. It actually sparked a huge northern rebellion that Henry violently crushed. By transferring roughly a quarter of all English land to a newly loyal class of wealthy elites, Henry accidentally ensured that this reformation would stick. Because think about it, reversing it would mean taking all that lucrative land back from the very people who now governed the country.
But the personal cost of this revolution was absolutely staggering. Henry's frantic search for a healthy son led to 6 different marriages, and it left a trail of ruined lives. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside. Anne Boleyn, the woman he literally broke the world to marry, failed to produce a son and went from queen to the executioner's block in a mere 19 days. Let that sink in. Jane Seymour finally gave him a son, Edward, but then died 12 days later. Anne of Cleves survived via annulment. The teenage Catherine Howard was executed, and his last wife, Catherine Parr, barely survived a conservative plot against her.
Moving right along to Part 3, A Kingdom Divided.
So the succession crisis was temporarily solved by the birth of Henry's son, Edward VI. But his arrival triggered decades of terrifying religious whiplash. Henry died in 1547, leaving a 9-year-old boy on the throne. Under Edward, the country became aggressively Protestant. The defining document of this era is the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. It mandated that church worship be conducted in English rather than the traditional Latin. For everyday citizens whose entire lives revolved around these traditional Catholic rituals, this was deeply, deeply shocking. It sparked massive outrage and armed rebellions among traditional Catholics who demanded the return of the Latin Mass.
But Edward's reign was short. He died at just 15. And after a brief, totally failed plot to put his cousin on the throne, Henry's eldest daughter, Mary I, seized the crown. Mary was fiercely Catholic, and the pendulum swung violently backward. She repealed the Protestant laws, reunited the English Church with Rome, and ruthlessly punished anyone who resisted. 280. That is roughly how many Protestants Mary ordered burned at the stake over a span of just a few years. Even the main architect of the Protestant reforms himself, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, was caught in this. Under extreme pressure, Cranmer had actually signed documents recanting his Protestant faith, but when the time came for his execution, he withdrew those recantations. As the flames rose, he thrust his right hand, the exact hand that had signed the false documents, into the fire first, declaring, "That hand shall burn first." This powerful act of martyrdom unintentionally cemented a fierce Protestant identity in England that the government simply could not stamp out.
Which leads us to Part 4, Elizabeth's Golden Age.
When Mary died childless in 1558, the crown passed to Henry VIII's daughter by Anne Boleyn. Out of all this blood-soaked division emerged Elizabeth I. Having survived the dangerous reigns of her siblings basically by mastering the art of silence, Elizabeth immediately cooled the religious extremes with the 1559 settlement. She established a middle way. She became the supreme governor, rather than head, of the church, and introduced a prayer book that was very carefully worded. It was Protestant enough for the reformers to embrace, but ambiguous enough for moderate Catholics to tolerate. She proved she completely understood that maintaining peace was far more effective than policing her subjects' inner beliefs.
Now, stability at home definitely didn't mean safety abroad. After Elizabeth executed her Catholic rival, Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic Spain decided it was time to force England's submission once and for all. In 1588, Philip II launched the massive Spanish Armada, but the English used their lighter, more agile ships to shadow the Spanish. On July 28th, they unleashed burning fire ships into the crowded Spanish anchorage, completely breaking their formation. The next day, English artillery caused massive damage. Forced to flee north, the Armada was completely shattered by brutal North Sea storms. It was an astonishing, monumental victory.
And Elizabeth really showcased her absolute masterclass in politics during this crisis. While her troops were waiting for a Spanish invasion that ultimately never landed, she went to Tilbury and delivered these legendary words. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." She didn't hide from the gender prejudices of her era. She confronted them head-on, turning her status as a virgin queen into this profound statement of national unity and royal strength.
And finally, Part 5, the Tudor Legacy. When Elizabeth died in 1603 without an heir, the Tudor line officially came to an end. But man, did it leave behind some massive, completely unintended consequences. This is really the ultimate irony of the dynasty. To break with Rome and enforce their will, Henry VIII and his ministers had to elevate the legislative power of Parliament. It was a brilliant tool for them because they had the skill to manage it. But by doing this, they accidentally planted the seeds of a political culture that was willing to challenge the crown itself. Decades later, when the Stuart dynasty took over, kings like Charles I clashed with this newly empowered parliament, sparking a civil war that actually ended with his own execution in 1649. The Tudor structure was incredibly powerful, but in less capable hands it proved fatally fragile.
So this brings us right back to our opening question. Think about everything we've just covered today. Considering the financial extortion of Henry VII, the bloody executions and monastery destructions of Henry VIII, the extreme religious whiplash under Edward and Mary, and the high-stakes survival game under Elizabeth, share your choice in the comments. Which ruler would you have chosen to live under?
Ultimately, the Tudor dynasty vanished after 118 years. They were certainly not the most stable family in the world, but their sheer consequence transformed a somewhat medieval kingdom on the edge of Europe into a modern power that would eventually rule the seas. They built a state so structurally resilient that it survived civil war, revolution, and restoration long after the last Tudor was laid to rest. It really leaves us to wonder, is true national transformation only ever born out of utter ruthlessness? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.